In a courtroom, a white police officer challenges a black judge, but what he didn't know was that that moment of arrogance would be the beginning of a regret he never imagined. What happened next will turn everything upside down. Stay until and to discover how truth and justice prevailed in an unexpected way. Diana Moreira was late once again. As he parked in front of the courthouse, he looked at the clock on the dashboard. 10 minutes until the hearing began. His heart raced. This wasn't just any day. Was the day, the judgment she feared but prepared for with every fiber of her being. A case capable of turning the tide on racial profiling in the state's courts. She took a deep breath, got out of the car, straightened her posture, and walked forward. As a black judge, Diana had already faced immense challenges. But today, the weight was different. The case was personal. The defendant, Marcos Santiago, a young black man, had been arrested in his own neighborhood without reason. The officer who detained him claimed he fit the description of a suspect. The pain of this reality was familiar, very familiar. With her heels echoing across the pavement, Diana walked across the square. Instead of going through the main entrance, packed with journalists and cameras, she did something unexpected. The tension was palpable. Diana was approaching a side door of the New York City courthouse when her eyes fell on a young black officer on guard. His posture was firm, his eyes fixed on her, evaluating each step. Diana, already used to challenges, raised her neck, ready to identify herself. But before he could speak, the police officer blocked his path. "I need to see your identification, ma'am," he said, his tone deadpan. Diana sighed, removing her judge's badge with calculated precision. "I'm Judge Moreira. I'm presiding over Santiago's case this morning." He barely looked at the badge. His eyes looked her up and down, cold and calculating. "There's an incident nearby, and you fit the description of a suspect. I need you to answer some questions," he said, distrust evident in his voice. Diana, frozen for a moment, stared at the officer. The irony of the situation hit her hard. Here she was, about to preside over a historic racial profiling trial, and now she found herself the victim of the same prejudice she was fighting against in court. What happened at the doors of the court itself seemed like a cruel joke. "I don't have time for this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, even though her heart was racing. "The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get in." Holding up the badge again, she hoped the officer would recognize the error, but he wouldn't give in. His hand reached for his belt, almost touching the gun. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he said, stepping forward. "You need to follow me." The air seemed to have gone out of Diana's lungs. The situation was getting out of control. She saw something in his eyes that she already knew well since her days in the South, a mixture of distrust and judgment. It wasn't about her position as a judge. It was about her being black. Before he could react, a deep voice cut through the silence. "What's going on here?" Diana quickly turned around and saw another officer, also black, approaching. He looked surprised and worried. When he recognized her, his eyes widened. "Is she Judge Moreira?" he asked in disbelief. "Yes," Diana replied firmly, still trying to control the situation. The second officer looked at the young man seriously. "Stop it, now." The young man hesitated, but did not give in completely. "She fits the description," he muttered, trying to justify his actions. The tension was at its limit, and what would happen next? "Do you want to lose your job?" Diana narrowed her eyes, her tone sharp. The young officer took a step back, removing his hand from his belt. He murmured something inaudible, but didn't dare say anything else. Diana took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Losing control would only give the situation more power. "Everything is fine?" the older officer asked, his concern evident. "I am," she replied, although her hands were shaking. Without another word, Diana headed towards the building, feeling the weight of the moment. As she entered the courtroom, the sterile, cold environment welcomed her, offering a minimal sense of relief. But as he walked through the halls, the scene outside replayed in his mind like a broken record. She had faced racism throughout her life, but experiencing it on the day of such a crucial trial was almost unbearable. Upon entering the hearing room, a profound silence took over. Diana banged the gavel, calling order, and the trial began with the parties' opening statements. However, his mind was still far away, returning to that scene with the police officer. The way he judged her instantly seemed to reflect the very case she was about to preside over. Soon, Kevin Daniels, the defendant, was called to testify. Diana watched as he ascended the pulpit, his posture filled with pain and indignation. He recounted how he was approached by police as he walked peacefully through his neighborhood. He had done nothing wrong, but he was treated like a criminal. Handcuffed and humiliated in front of his community, his words reverberated through the room, heavy and poignant. Diana felt an immediate connection with each of them. It wasn't just about Kevin. It was about everyone who had ever experienced the same thing, including her. As Kevin's testimony continued, the door to the room opened. Diana felt her heart race when she saw the young police officer outside, the same one who had stopped her hours before. He walked in, his face a mix of nervousness and tension, and headed to the witness stand. The prosecutor approached. "We would like to call Officer William Wilkins to the stand." Diana, now knowing his name, watched as he sat visibly uncomfortable. She had to remember to be impartial, to maintain a professional demeanor. But it was difficult. This was the same man who had treated her as a suspect just hours before. "Mr. Wilkins," the prosecutor began, "please describe your role in the arrest of Kevin Daniels." "I was patrolling the neighborhood. When I saw Daniels," Wilkins began, his voice wavering and very different from the confidence he had displayed before. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there. Diana pressed her hands against the arms of the chair, feeling a growing pressure. Out of place. She had heard that phrase 1,000,000 times. It was a euphemism, a disguised code. "He's black, and I didn't think he should be there." The prosecutor pressed incisively. "What exactly made Mr. Daniels seem out of place, Mr. Wilkins?" The officer adjusted himself in the uncomfortable chair, his furtive eyes looking around, as if he was plotting something. Diana contained her anger. She had already reviewed the case before the trial. Daniels was just hoping for a friend. There was no crime, no suspicious behavior. "Mr. Wilkins," insisted the prosecutor, "did you find anything in Daniels that indicated the commission of a crime?" Wilkins hesitated. His expression became tense. He knew the answer, but he couldn't admit it. "Finally, we found nothing." Silence took over the room. Diana took a deep breath, the weight of the confession tightening her chest. It was clear. Kevin Daniels had been arrested for one reason only. He was a black man, in the wrong place, in the wrong eyes. Diana felt the tension rise in the courtroom as she watched the jury's reactions. Some were visibly impacted, others seemed divided. The truth, however, was undeniable. Marcos Santiago, like Daniels, had been arrested simply for being black, in a neighborhood where he did not belong. Bill Wilkins' testimony continued, but his answers began to falter, small inconsistencies, piling up until his version of events fell apart. Diana noticed his discomfort, the furtive glances he cast in her direction. He now knew who she was and understood the weight of what he had done. Marcos's lawyer, Green, delivered her closing statement with conviction. "This case isn't just about Marcos Santiago," she said, looking steadily at the jury. "It's about a pattern, A pattern we see over and over again in our justice system. It's about officers like Bill Wilkins who look at a black man and assume the worst. And it's about the consequences of those assumptions: humiliation, injustice, and lives destroyed. What would happen now? The verdict was about to be decided. It's time to say enough is enough. The silence that followed was palpable. Diana felt the change in the air. The jury was listening. They were understanding what was at stake. When the trial adjourned for the day, Diana stood alone in the empty courtroom, revisiting each moment. She had handled the case fairly, but the confrontation with Wilkins in the lobby still lingered in her mind. It was a cruel reminder. It didn't matter your position, your competence, or your achievements. She would always be seen, first, by the color of her skin. Shortly afterwards, Sergeant Michael Harris entered the room. He approached with a respectful but worried tone. "Judge Moreira," he said calmly, "may I speak to you?" Surprised, Diana nodded. "Of course, Sergeant." Harris hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I wanted to talk about Wilkins. He's not a bad guy, but he carries some prejudices like many. I'm trying to change that from the inside." Diana looked at him, analyzing his words. "Prejudices? You mean racism?" he asked bluntly. Harris sighed, but didn't deny it. "Yes, maybe. Probably. But the point is, changes don't happen overnight. They need to be worked on." Diana, with her gaze fixed, asked, "And what do you suggest I do when I'm here, listening to cases like this, while reliving experiences I've had personally?" Harris stared at her for a moment before responding firmly, "Keep doing what you're doing, Judge, standing up for justice, even when the system tries to demoralize you." Diana nodded slowly. Despite the crushing weight of responsibility, she knew Harris was right. The fight was still far from over, but each day in court was a chance to take a step forward. The next morning, the courtroom was buzzing. Reporters and protesters gathered outside, reflecting the national impact of the case. It was no longer a local issue. Now it had become a symbol of structural racism in the justice system. While awaiting the verdict, Diana looked around the courtroom, thinking about the previous day's events, especially Bill's testimony. He wasn't just a prejudiced cop. It was a product of a system that perpetuated these prejudices. For the first time, he seemed to see this system begin to crumble around him. Diana knew that today's verdict might not solve everything, but it was an essential step towards justice. Even with the weight of future battles, she took a deep breath, prepared to face whatever came. Diana Moreira knew that Bill Wilkins was not just a prejudiced individual. He was the reflection of a flawed system. The trial was not just about his guilt, but about forcing a conversation that the country had long avoided. She carried the weight of responsibility for justice in that specific case, but the symbolism of that decision could change everything. It was more than a single verdict. It was about reforming a system that allowed prejudice and racial profiling to perpetuate without real consequences. The knock on the door brought Diana back to reality. "Come in," she said, controlling her voice. Emily, her assistant, came in holding a sheet of paper. "The jury is ready," he informed softly. Diana stood up, took a deep breath, and straightened her toga. "Let's sort this out." As he crossed the hallway, his footsteps echoed, mixing with the tension that permeated the air of the courtroom. The room was packed. Reporters were in the back, cameras at the ready. The families of Marcos Santiago and Bill Wilkins occupied the front rows, both anxious and apprehensive. Diana took her place and glanced briefly at Marcos. His face was serious, but there was a gleam of hope in his eyes. The expectation that this moment meant something greater. When he looked at Bill, he noticed the difference. He was visibly uneasy, his eyes darting away from everyone around him, as if he knew the weight of what he had done was about to fall on him. Please call the jury, Diana requested. The doors opened and the 12 jurors entered. Diana watched them closely. Their faces were indecipherable. The jury foreman held the paper with the verdict, her hands shaking slightly. Did the jury reach a verdict? Diana asked, her voice firm. Yes, Your Honor, the woman replied, trembling. Please read the verdict. The head of the jury took a deep breath before announcing, in the case of Officer Bill Wilkins, we, the jury, found the defendant guilty of abuse of power and racial discrimination. The room erupted in murmurs. Marcos Santiago remained motionless, for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Then relief washed over him. Tears began to flow as his lawyer congratulated him. Diana looked away at Bill Wilkins. He stood still, hands clasped, visibly shaken. His face was blank, but his eyes betrayed the internal battle he was facing. Court is closed, Diana announced, slamming the gavel. The room was buzzing with reporters and spectators. Suddenly, Bill Wilkins stood up. Your Honor, he called, his voice wavering. The room fell silent again. Diana fixed her eyes on him, waiting. Wilkins looked vulnerable, almost lost. He looked at the ground before trying to form the words. I need to say something, he began, his voice breaking. I thought I was protecting my community. I thought I was doing right, but I was wrong. My assumptions, my biases, colored my judgment, and I'm sorry. An uncomfortable silence took over the room. Diana felt the sincerity in his words, but she knew it wasn't enough. Diana couldn't help but remember all the times she herself had been the target of racism. The pain caused by actions like Bill Wilkins was profound, irreparable. He had apologized, but Diana knew that a simple apology didn't solve anything. Officer Wilkins, Diana said firmly, the harm caused by your actions, and actions like yours, affects lives, families, and entire communities. An apology does not resolve this. The weight of his words hung in the air as Diana closed the day, aware that the fight was far from over, but also convinced that, at that moment, justice had been done. Bill Wilkins remained silent, defeated. He didn't try to justify himself or make any more excuses. He stood there, accepting the consequences of his actions. For the first time, Diana saw something in his eyes, not just regret, but genuine understanding. As the courtroom slowly began to empty, Diana watched Marcos Santiago hugging his family, relief mixed with exhaustion on his face. On his way out, Wilkins waited to be escorted, the weight of condemnation evident in his posture. Diana knew she had fulfilled her role, presiding over the trial fairly and ensuring that the law was applied. But still, something didn't seem enough. This case was just a drop in an ocean of injustice. For every Marcos Santiago who found justice, countless others remained forgotten, their stories unheard, their lives marked by decisions that would never make it to court. Suddenly, the courtroom door opened again. Sergeant Michael Harris entered. Diana looked at him in surprise when she saw him. He looked tired, but he also carried something that seemed to be hope. Judge Moreira, may I have a word? He asked, his voice low. Diana nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Of course, Sergeant. He pulled out a chair and sat down, clasping his hands before him. I just wanted, thank you, he said sincerely. Diana raised an eyebrow in surprise. Thank you for what? For handling this case the way you did. For keeping justice a priority. We need that. The system needs that, Harris responded, her voice filled with sincerity. Diana sighed deeply, leaning back in her chair. I appreciate it, Sergeant, but honestly, I don't know if it's enough. This was just one case. There are still so many others out there, so many people who will never see justice. Harris nodded, his face serious. You're right, but that's why we need to keep going. We don't change the system overnight, but every step matters, every case. Like this is a step in the right direction. Diana was silent, reflecting on her words. She wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that real change was possible. But after everything I had seen and experienced, it was difficult to keep hope intact. "And Wilkins?" she asked, barely audible. "What happens to officers like him, those who have been shaped by a system that teaches them to think this way?" Harris hesitated before responding. "It's hard, I'm not going to lie. There are a lot of people like him, but there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside, and I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Diana looked into his eyes, not only seeing anxiety, but also resolute determination. It was the same determination she felt, despite all the frustrations. "Keep doing what you're doing, Judge. This is how we change this piece by piece," Harris said. Diana nodded slowly, repeating the words. Piece by piece. When Harris left, Diana was left alone in the empty room, looking at the unoccupied benches. She knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it never would. But that day, they had taken a step forward, and that was enough to start. Shortly afterwards, she was interrupted by Marcos Santiago and his lawyer. Marcos Santiago and his lawyer approached Diana. Although he still carried the weight of the last few days, Marcos's face was calmer. "Judge Moreira," the lawyer began, "we just wanted to thank you for everything." Diana looked at them in surprise. "You don't need to thank me. I just did my job." Marcos shook his head, a slight smile appearing on his lips. "It was more than that," he said, his voice firm. "This trial wasn't just about me. It was about showing the world what happens to us every day. It was about giving a voice to those who aren't normally heard." Diana absorbed his words. The depth of it touched her. "I hope this is a step towards change," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But it's just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to be done." Marcos nodded, his gaze determined. "I know, but it's a start. And for that, I'm grateful." As he and his lawyer walked away, Diana felt a mixture of hope and regret. A trial would not resolve everything, would not dismantle a system that had existed for centuries. But it was a start, a small but significant step. She took a deep breath, standing up and slowly walking towards her chambers. Their footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, each one charged with purpose. Diana knew there was still a lot to do, but she also knew she was ready to keep fighting. Upon leaving the courtroom, Diana hesitated to find Bill Wilkins sitting against the side door. He looked defeated, his uniform now weighing him down irreparably. The silence between the two was almost unbearable, a mixture of shame, anger, and confusion hanging in the air. "Judge Moreira," Bill began, his voice hoarse and full of weight, "I didn't expect to see you here." Diana remained silent, her gaze fixed on him. I didn't know what he could say to change something, but he allowed him to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he said, the words coming out slowly. "About what happened in there and what I did to you." He paused, his hands restless. "I know an apology won't fix what I did, but I need you to know that I never wanted this to happen." Diana raised her eyebrows, her voice cold and firm. "You never wanted this to happen, but it did, Mr. Wilkins. And it continues to happen, to people like Marcos, to people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse now." Bill hesitated but didn't back down. Determined, he continued, "I know I was wrong. I know I let my biases guide my actions, and now I'm trying to understand. It's not something you unlearn overnight. I was taught to see the world in a specific way, and I never questioned it." Diana crossed her arms, her expression stern. "And what's changed now? The fact that he got caught? Or the fact that someone finally confronted him about it?" Bill looked down, clearly shaken. "Both, perhaps," he said, his voice trembling. "But I also realized that I need to change. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to be different from now on." Diana watched him, trying to decide if she believed him. It was difficult, after everything he had experienced. Trusting the sincerity of promises like that seemed impossible. She took a deep breath before answering firmly, "Mr. Wilkins, the responsibility to change is not yours alone. The system that shaped your beliefs needs to be challenged and reformed. Words are not enough. Actions are." Bill nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. He stood still for a moment, as if he understood the impact of what he had just admitted, and then walked away, leaving Diana alone. She sighed, feeling the weight of the day still on her shoulders. She walked towards her chambers, but before entering, a voice called her. "Judge Moreira," said Marcos Santiago, accompanied by his lawyer. His voice was calm, but there was an intensity behind it. "I want to thank you for everything." Diana looked at him, surprised. "You don't need to thank me, Marcos. I just did my job." Marcos, with a serious look, replied, "It wasn't just that. This trial wasn't just about me. It was about showing the world what really happens to us every day. You gave me a voice." Diana felt a lump in her throat, understanding perfectly what he meant. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But it's just the beginning. We have a long way to go." Marcos nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. "I know, but it's a start. And for that, I am grateful." As he and his lawyer walked away, Diana stood there, deep in thought. A single trial would not be enough to dismantle a system rooted in centuries of injustice, but as Marcos had said, it was a start. Diana made her way to her chambers, her steps slow and deliberate. Each movement seemed to carry the weight of a greater struggle, of battles that were yet to come. The day was over, but the impact of that case was just beginning to unfold. On her way out of the courtroom, Diana ran into Bill Wilkins again. He was visibly uncomfortable, with his hands restless and his eyes anxious, but there were no signs of escape in his posture. He seemed there, ready to face the consequences of his actions. "Both," he replied, his voice shaking. "But I also realized that I need to change. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to be different from now on." Diana crossed her arms, her expression closed. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of her own experiences and those of so many other people prevented her from letting her guard down so easily. "Mr. Wilkins," she said firmly, "changing is not just an individual choice. It is an ongoing commitment. There is no point in acknowledging your mistakes if you do nothing to correct them." He nodded, clearly understanding the seriousness of her words. "I know," he said, his voice calmer. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to learn. I want to be better." Diana remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. Finally, he took a deep breath, relaxing his shoulders. "I hope you're serious, because it's not just about you. It's about the system you represent, a system that urgently needs to change." Bill tilted his head, acknowledging the truth of his words, before slowly walking away. Diana watched him until he disappeared into the hallway, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She knew that the road to change would be long, and that moments like that, no matter how small they seemed, were part of the process. Still, a trial and a conversation would not be enough to dismantle centuries of injustice. But they were a step. With a sigh, Diana turned and walked toward the exit. The fight was far from over, but that day, the truth had prevailed, and that was enough to continue the journey for justice. The fight doesn't end here. Every step is crucial. Have you ever seen something like this happen? Share your experience in the comments. If you believe in the importance of real change, subscribe to the channel to follow more stories that illuminate the challenges and victories in the search for equality. Together we can build a fairer future.